Hello and welcome to Airheads, a not-so-serious look at the serious business of royal rumours, gossip and gowns. I'm Tom.
And I'm Maeve.
And happy Lunar New Year to all our listeners.
From Airheads and from Sarah Ferguson.
She did a pretty wacky post this week featuring a brand new custom illustration of the ox for the year of the ox and a little, what I can only assume is an author photo from quite some time ago in the corner.
A real glamour shot. And what was interesting to me was that the text underneath this illustration said that it was from the book The Legend of Ting Peng by Sarah, Duchess of York. So obviously immediately Googled Legend of Ting Peng, nothing coming up. Nothing at all. So I'm very interested. Is this an upcoming title? Is this anything to do with her Mills and Boon? Is this a romance? Is this some sort of history of ancient China? She liked the name Ting Peng. Why does she feel she is the person to tell this story? What have we done to deserve this story, Sarah Ferguson?
I feel like we're never going to hear about the Legend of Ting Peng ever again, but I really want to know so much more about this. But something that we did learn a good bit more about this week was the Queen's consent.
This was a lengthy investigation in The Guardian this week on the topic of Queen's consent and how it has been used, or perhaps abused, in a far more extensive way than was previously believed. And, you know, I have to say, and some of our listeners have said this to us as well, that these reports are at times very dense and complicated when you're reading them. So Tom and I have been trying to make sense of them and trying to explain them in the most simplistic terms possible.
Terms that even we understand.
I know, if you can believe that. It is worth reading, though, the full series of The Guardian, or if you don't feel like reading it, the reporter David Pegg did an interview on The Guardian's Today in Focus podcast, which is like 25 minutes long, very easy to listen to if you do want to know more about this.
Yeah, I found that really helpful, that podcast. But let's start with what is Queen's consent. So it's a little-known parliamentary procedure which originated in the 1700s and is, of course, still being used today, whereby the government asks the Queen's permission for Parliament to be able to debate laws that affect her.
Yes, it's a very arcane procedure which requires the government to send draft legislation to the Queen or, on occasion, to Prince Charles, so that they and their lawyers can examine whether the legislation affects either the royal prerogative, which is fundamental powers of state such as the ability to declare war, or the assets of the crown, such as the royal palaces. And Buckingham Palace says that the procedure also covers assets that the Queen owns privately, such as the estates of Sandringham and Balmoral.
So if the parliamentary lawyers decide that a bill requires consent, a government minister writes the Queen formally requesting her permission for Parliament to debate it, and a copy of that bill is sent to the Queen's private lawyers, who have 14 days to consider it and to advise her.
It's so funny they have to ask the Queen's permission to debate, like, traffic rules.
Yeah, because there are so many things that they listed out in these Guardian reports, and like they said, some of them it's very difficult to know how they relate to the Queen. But anyway, if the Queen grants her consent, then Parliament can debate the legislation, and if she withholds consent, the bill cannot proceed and Parliament is in effect banned from debating it. And the royal household claims consent has only ever been withheld on the advice of government ministers.
Yeah, and you might have heard before of royal assent, which is a formality that takes place at the end of the process of drafting a bill, when the Queen's agreement is required to turn a bill into an act of Parliament. But that's at the end.
Yeah.
Queen's consent takes place before Parliament is even allowed to debate the legislation. It's very different.
And because royal assent happens at the end, it means that people who are following this kind of thing in Parliament will be aware of what's being debated and will be aware of these bills. And so it seems like this is very much definitely a formality. Like if the Queen were to not grant royal assent for a bill that has been publicly debated, then it would be very obvious, like, what the hell is the Queen doing?
Royal assent is listed on the royal family's website as one of the Queen's official duties, which I've seen in some royal discussions that it seems to have led people to assume that Queen's consent falls under that category too, but the royal website describes Queen's consent as a long-established convention, and The Guardian notes that constitutional scholars have tended to regard it as an opaque but harmless example of the pageantry that surrounds the monarchy. So it is quite different.
Yeah.
And Buckingham Palace insists that the Queen's role is purely formal, but the Guardian's reporting suggests it is a little bit more complicated than that, and that's why we want to talk about it today.
Yeah, we should note that, like a lot of things that involve the royal family, the procedure, as Maeve said, is opaque, and The Guardian reports that previous attempts to understand even the basic functioning of Queen's consent have been aggressively resisted. Quote, an academic who in 2011 requested the government's guidelines on how consent is applied spent 2 years fighting a legal case before it was released.
Yeah, so that's just like a little bit of background on what Queen's consent is, but you know, I feel like a lot of people may have seen these headlines and then started to read it and were like, oh, this requires too much concentration. But what stood out to me was listening to that Today in Focus episode. The reporter David Pegg himself said that aspects of this investigation are profoundly tedious, which I thought was funny, but that the top line, according to him, is that the documents he found seem to show a direct intervention in legislation by a representative of the Queen to secure a change that would be substantially to her advantage.
Which is a massive deal. Like, the Queen should not be interfering in the drafting of legislation at all. So, like, if that's the only thing that you take away, and if you don't want to know any more details, you just remember that. But the really big news from this is that in the 70s, the Queen successfully lobbied Edward Heath's government to change a proposed transparency law in order to hide her true wealth from the public. And her private lawyer put pressure on ministers to alter draft legislation to prevent her shareholdings from being disclosed. So royal finance expert David McClure told the Mail it's unusual that she used her lawyers and not her private secretary, who would typically attend such meetings and communicate with the government on her behalf. So she made sure to lawyer up.
And when her lawyer went to this meeting, he reportedly said that it would be embarrassing for the Queen's private fortune to be made public. And we've talked about this before, you know, nobody knows how much she's really worth, partly because of what she did here.
Yeah.
But it's estimated that her private wealth could be anywhere between £300 million up to in excess, or even well in excess of £1 billion.
Jesus Christ.
And one of the things David McClure was asking is, like, why is this embarrassing? Like, is it that if her private investments were disclosed that it would reveal investments in some unsavoury firms? Because, as we know, the Paradise Papers revealed that her private estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, had invested in offshore accounts and some dodgy firms. But I think it's more likely that she thinks that pretending she's less rich will somehow make people more comfortable with and connect better with her. People like, you know, peasants like us.
Yeah. No, I think that's probably more likely, although obviously I wouldn't be surprised if there was some unsavoury investment going on. Yeah. But following the Queen's intervention, the government inserted a clause into this law granting itself the power to exempt companies used by heads of state from new transparency measures. And officially, the change would be for the benefit of a variety of wealthy investors. But in practice, the Queen was plainly the intended beneficiary of the arrangement, according to The Guardian.
And this arrangement, The Guardian says, was used in effect to create a state-backed shell corporation, which is understood to have placed a veil of secrecy over the Queen's private fortune until at least 2011.
God, she got what she wanted.
I know, and, you know, obviously coming from an anti-monarchist group, this isn't surprising, but I did think Graham Smith from Republic put it quite well when he said, "This is a clear abuse of power for personal gain, and it cannot be ignored. Britain's head of state has secretly lobbied for a law to be tailor-made to protect her financial investments, directly contrary to the purpose of the law being passed by Parliament."
I couldn't have put it better myself. Like,
it's hard to argue with that.
Absolutely, yeah. And it really is, like, earth-shattering kind of news. Like, people like my parents who'd be very into the royals, they constantly go to this argument of, like, yeah, but the Queen doesn't actually affect anything. Like, don't get so angry because the Queen doesn't have any real power. She doesn't exercise any of the power that she has. But this investigation really exposes the truth of it. The Guardian, as part of this investigation, they compiled a database from the National Archives of at least 1,062 parliamentary bills, which averages out at about 14 times a year, that have been subjected to Queen's consent. And like you said, they've on everything from road safety to a bill on race relations, which was a particularly weird one.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out what this had to do with the Queen, but it was a bill to extend the Race Relations Act of 1976, the one which makes it unlawful to discriminate on racial grounds. And that just seemed like a real, like, standout example of what the fuck is the purpose of this Queen's consent.
Yeah.
This was in 1999. But the most recent example of Queen's consent being used are from last year, including an agricultural bill that the government consulted the Queen about over a period of 11 months, when senior officials at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs sent the royal household 4 letters discussing specific measures that affect the Crown's interests. And, like, this might sound like a little bit boring, but it relates to Sandringham because, as well as producing crops such as wheat, barley, beans and oats, her farm at Sandringham grows blackcurrants that are sold to make ribena, and also sells lamb to a major retailer, and 8 tenant farmers rent 9,000 acres from Sandringham, all of which means that the Queen has a special personal interest in the government's agricultural policies. So throughout her reign, she and Prince Charles have vetted at least 8 parliamentary bills relating to agricultural issues.
And peers were told in November that the Queen had consented to the latest bill. Whether she lobbied behind the scenes for any changes to it, as documents suggest she appears to have done on previous occasions, is not known. She declined to respond when asked by The Guardian if she had made representations to the government, and the answer might not be revealed until the files are released to the National Archives in 2 decades' time.
It just gives you a sense of how opaque all of this is. And, you know, not that the royal family are ever known for transparency, but this is a particularly knotty issue, I think, all around Queen's consent. And we should note that a spokesperson for the Queen gave a statement to The Guardian where they said, "Queen's consent is a parliamentary process with the role of sovereign purely formal. Consent is always granted by the monarch where requested by government. Whether Queen's consent is required is decided by Parliament independently from the royal household in matters that would affect Crown interests, including personal property and personal interests of the monarch. If consent is required, draft legislation is, by convention, put to the sovereign to grant solely on advice of ministers and as a matter of public record."
But I think it bears repeating that what is really significant here is not the content of what she's being asked to weigh in on, but the fact that she's having any say at all and that there's clearly some intervention. So as David Pegg said, the Queen is not supposed to play a role in designing pieces of legislation, and yet what seems to be happening here is ministers are writing to the royal household requesting consent for bills, and rather than just getting a formal reply saying, yes, you can, they instead get a long letter back saying, well, we don't like this bit, or we don't like that bit. And that contravenes this very fundamental assumption that the Queen is separate from the legislative process.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That if this is a purely formal process, as they say, and that consent is always granted, then you'd think they'd just have this template that they send every time. Yes, you can. But it is significantly more complicated than that. And The Guardian also quoted Dr. Adam Tucker, who's a senior lecturer in constitutional law at the University of Liverpool, who pointed out, the whole tone of all this documentation is that this is completely normal. Everyone involved is treating it as a genuine dialogue about policy and an opportunity for legislation to be changed. If it was a purely formal process, which it's supposed to be, then no documentation like this would exist at all. There would be no substantive conversations about changing legislation. So what he's saying is that nobody seems at all surprised that they're getting back these letters that are opening a conversation around the proposed legislation rather than the cut and dried yes you can that you might expect. So that over the years it has become totally acceptable for the Queen to open a dialogue, like he says, and in a sense negotiate about this legislation.
Thomas Adams, who's a specialist in constitutional law at the University of Oxford, said that The Guardian's findings show the kind of influence over legislation that lobbyists would only ever dream of.
Yeah, I think he puts it pretty plainly there. And, you know, we should point out that Prince Charles has also been involved, and he's also used the Queen's consent procedure multiple times.
Yeah.
We're not going to get into all the details of that, but it is very interesting how he has used it to vet acts that prevent residents on his Duchy of Cornwall estate from buying their own homes.
Yeah.
I think that's worth reading about if you were, like us, interested in all the stories about Charles having his hands in people's pockets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think of kind of a lot of the stuff that The Guardian has in this series, the ones related to Charles actually have kind of quotes from real people who have been directly affected by these changes, like people talking about their homes and stuff,
But I did want to mention the comment piece The Guardian published by Norman Baker, who's a former Lib Dem MP, and he's also written books about the royals. But he calls the practice of Queen's consent a constitutional outrage. And he says, if an MP or peer sought to secretly influence a draft bill to advantage themselves in this way, it would be called corruption. It could lead to a criminal charge.
And he referred to the palace's quite misleading statement, which is what the BBC unfortunately led with on Monday, and which said, any assertion that the sovereign has blocked legislation is simply incorrect.
Yeah, which a lot of people pointed out that, you know, they weren't accusing the Queen of blocking legislation.
Yeah.
But he delineates it here where he says this is both accurate and entirely misleading. The Queen does not block legislation because she does not need to. The draft bill is sent to the palace and to her legal advisors. If they have objections, they will ring the Cabinet Office and relay these. Nothing is normally put in writing these days to avoid a written record. The bill is then altered to meet the Queen's wishes, and the revised version is then sent back and gains her consent. You see, nothing has been blocked.
Oh, it's all so sneaky. Oh. He goes on and says, the palace also says that the process is purely formal. So why is the Queen given 2 weeks or more to comment? And why are her legal advisors involved? Royal assent, which is indeed purely formal and brings a bill passed by Parliament into law, is given in less than 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought that was like a really great way of summing up something which just seemed so weird to me, this 2-week period to consult the bills when they're sent over. Like, surely you could just give the consent and then read them later if there's truly nothing that the Queen is allowed to do to change the laws. But the fact that there is this 2-week period is just, like, so ridiculous.
One of the things I liked was in Norman Baker's piece, he points out that, like a lot of things, that the palace likes to pretend that the practice of Queen's consent is all ceremonial and somehow rather quaint, which is something we see a lot. You know, oh, it's harmless, it's just part of the pageantry of the monarchy that everyone loves. But that in the 21st century, this practice is, he says, a gross affront to democracy. Other European monarchs see it as their duty to serve their country. Our monarch sees it as the country's duty to serve her. Uniquely, we are still officially subjects, not citizens. This royal arrogance and sense of entitlement is suffocating.
Oh, I loved this.
That's exactly right, isn't it?
Absolutely. And he adds that attempts to find out more about this process are made more difficult by the fact that the Freedom of Information Act also requires Queen's consent. The upshot of that he says, is that the ability to extract information about the royals is subject to exemptions and restrictions that apply to no other part of the public sector. And they are part of the public sector. It's just like, once you get into it, it's like a farce. It's like, how can anybody justify this in the 21st century?
And one of the things that they address is like what can be done about this. But the important thing to note is that Queen's Consent is simply a convention. So this would just be a question for Parliament. Like, abolishing Queen's Consent wouldn't require any legislation. It would literally just be a matter for MPs, sit around, agree, we're going to end this, and it's done that day. Easy. Yeah. Like, that's it. It's over in a day. That's all they have to do.
And something that was coming up with royal watchers is this question of like, well, if the Queen's meeting the Prime Minister all the time anyway, like, surely it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that she has influence on laws. Like, isn't that part of her role? And I think it's worth just pointing to the royal website on this, which says, the Queen has held a weekly audience with her Prime Minister throughout her reign in order to discuss government matters. The audience is held in an audience room in her apartments and is entirely private. Though the Queen remains politically neutral on all matters, she is able to advise and warn her ministers, including her Prime Minister, when necessary. So she has the right to advise and warn, but the Queen's consent process takes that so much further, and it honestly scuppers the claims of political neutrality and like basically allows her to lobby the government for her own personal interests.
Yeah, to protect her own private interests.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting, like, what that comment piece was saying, that, like, if an elected official did something like this, it would be seen as corruption.
Yeah.
The fact that she's an unelected official means that she's allowed to get away with it. Which,
in fact, should make it so much worse.
One thing that struck me was the coverage of this story, because it was surprisingly wide-ranging. Like, it was picked up all over the place by almost all of the major UK papers and broadcasters and the tabloids, including the Mail. So I know a lot of you were saying, well, why didn't the Mail cover this? They did. But also across Europe, in the Italian and German press were some of the examples I saw they were following up on this story. But, like, that being said, it is very dry.
Yeah.
And it isn't the most accessible story. And I was a little bit disappointed that more efforts weren't made to offer a kind of simplified version of it. I hope that's kind of what we've done here.
Was particularly disappointed, though, with the BBC's coverage of it. Like we said, they led with the palace's statement denying something that they weren't even being accused of, the blocking legislation thing. They later updated it with a new headline and analysis from their royal correspondent, Johnny Diamond.
Yeah, he wrote, "Why is the palace denying a threat of a block, something that no one has alleged? Because, says a source, the allegations put to it by The Guardian were broader than those that turned up in the story published yesterday." And he also said that the tone of the correspondence published by The Guardian is a little surprising. It suggests a degree of involvement that belies the palace's claim that the mechanism is simply a formality. That's a mild way of putting it.
Yeah.
But I think, just to sum it up, like, why is this story important? Because it shows that the Queen is directly intervening in legislation when we have been led all along to believe that she is not involved in designing legislation, that she is politically neutral, that she is completely outside of this, and that it's just a purely formal process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, like, something that I found myself doing was, like, slightly being sidetracked in reading these and being like, oh, well, you know, the agricultural bills concern her because she has so much agricultural land and involvement. It's like, actually, that shouldn't matter at all. This actually makes it worse that she's being shown the laws beforehand, that, like, just being queen and having a lot of agricultural land doesn't mean that she should be able to shape the laws that affect that. That shouldn't be anybody's right as, like, someone with a private interest in things like this.
It's a clear conflict of interest.
So that's something that I really tried to just hold on to as I was reading these pieces.
I don't think anything's going to happen from this.
No, of course not. They tend to be able to wait these things out, especially as the kind of 20-year gap between things happening and them becoming available in National Archives means that, like, how exercised are people going to get about something which happened 2 decades ago?
Yeah, and she'll be dead when we find out what happened with this agricultural bill.
Well, let's move on then to our quote of the week.
Oh, I loved this, Tom. This comes from, well, the news story first is that Princess Eugenie had her baby. It's a boy, born at Portland Hospital, which is also where Archie was born. And this boy is now 11th in the order of succession, which means Prince Edward knocks down the 12th place. But quote of the week was my favourite line from the palace's statement about the birth, which is that Jack Brooksbank was present.
That made me laugh so much.
I just love this because I feel like if you stopped any random person in the street and you'd be like, who's Jack Brooksbank? No one would know.
And especially if you're like, and why was he present at the birth
So
of
if you
Princess
saw
Eugenie?
this statement, you'd think like, whoa, who is this guy? What was he doing there? Jack Brooksbank, why are they saying him like I'm meant to know who the fuck that is? But even better than that, I thought, was that Casamigos, the tequila brand, part owned by George Clooney, sent out an amazing press release fucking 11 minutes after the birth was announced, which read, due to the recent news surrounding the arrival of the royal baby from HRH Princess Eugenie and Jack Brooksbank, we wanted to drop you a note to ask if you were to mention any further details about Jack Brooksbank that you use his official title, European Brand Director of Casamigos Tequila. So what the palace should have said was, European Brand Director of Casamigos Tequila, Jack Brooksbank was present. So funny.
Yeah, they're definitely saying, look, the British royals aren't the only people who have protocol that needs following and who have, titles that are incredibly important. I like the idea that he was there in his role as brand ambassador for Casamigos.
But Eugenie shared the news of this birth with a black and white photo of her holding the baby's hand on Instagram, her own Instagram, which was, as the Daily Mail put it, a break with royal tradition. And I saw a lot of Sussex fans were very unhappy about this. And a lot of people were asking us, like, why weren't the protocol police out for blood the way they were when Meghan Markle gave birth? And my answer to this, I don't know about you, Tom, but my answer to this would be no one gives a shit about Eugenie's baby.
I would wholeheartedly agree with you, and I would go further to say most people in this country not only didn't realise she was pregnant, but wouldn't know who she is. And certainly if you were to say Beatrice and Eugenie, they might be like, oh yeah, okay, show them a picture of the two together. They would not be able to tell you which one is which.
No way. You could show them a picture of any two white ladies of their age and they'd be like, sure.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if they were wearing hats.
And I feel like just like even the suggestion that the interest in or demand for access to Eugenie and Jack's baby would or should be comparable to Prince Harry and Meghan's baby is like absolutely absurd and honestly like willfully ignorant.
Absolutely. I mean, like, we're very much here for comparing the coverage of Meghan and Kate to see how that differs. But to bring Eugenie into it is like stupid.
They're in different leagues.
Yeah.
Is one way of putting it. Well, speaking of Kate though, we're going to our little Kate silo, Fit for a Queen, where we talk about Kate Zoom every week. Kate Zoom style. Because she's zooming in again, this time to mark the 5th anniversary of Little Village, which is an organisation that donates pre-loved clothes, toys and equipment to babies and children in need. And I loved this cool new top she was wearing on the Zoom. This is from LK Bennett. And it's a cotton merino jumper with a sort of 70s style collar. Got her favourite buttons, navy buttons.
A lot of navy buttons.
And matching stitch detail. I thought it was a gorgeous top.
Do you think she saw it on Holly Willoughby last month?
I saw on the blog What Kate Wore that Holly Willoughby of This Morning was wearing it on the show at the end of January. And Tom, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Kate had been influenced because for our listeners outside of the UK, Holly Willoughby is an absolutely colossal fashion influencer over here.
Yeah.
She is the Colossus, isn't she? Who's a bigger influencer than Holly Willoughby?
She's certainly up there with Kate, and like possibly, is this them butting heads? Are they new fashion rivals? Who wore it better? I really liked it. I liked the collar. I love a big collar, but
do you wish she was wearing flares to really tap into the 70s-ness? Do you think she was wearing flares?
Yeah,
we don't know.
She was. I know. She was wearing flares
and platforms.
Yeah, I did really like it. It's very much now, I think, like, what has Kate worn on Zoom, and I am missing the glamorous days of, spectacular royal style quite a bit. But this was a nice shirt.
In other Kate fashion news, the Telegraph fashion journalist Beth Ann Holt has a new book out about Kate's style over the last decade. And there was one thing I saw that she talked about in an interview with Vanity Fair that I wanted to mention. She gave a little bit of insight into what goes into the planning for royal tour wardrobes. And she was speaking about the Pakistan tour in 2019. She said, I interviewed the owner of the boutique where they source a lot of the clothes, and the trip was in October, but the owner of the boutique only heard from Natasha Archer, that's Kate's assistant, in September. It was a really quick turnaround.
That's crazy to me.
That is so much quicker than I would have thought.
Yeah.
And like a lot of the stuff we've heard from royal fashion experts and stuff is that, months of planning, even years of planning go into royal tours because of how significant they are and because of the kind of soft diplomacy that duchesses have to do when they're abroad like this, that the level of planning and the detail that it requires is enormous. So to see that they were sort of cobbling it together in a matter of weeks was very surprising to me.
Yeah, I mean, it made me think, do I spend longer planning my holiday outfits than Kate does?
And Beth Ann Holt also talked about interviewing the Mumbai-based designer Anita Dongre, who said, it was just those few weeks and it was such a rush working on it constantly. She said, I'd always thought that these things were really planned far in advance. And she said that Kate's team were kind of like swans. They just make everything look so easy while they're scrambling to pull a wardrobe together.
To which I'd say, like, Kate's team are really making other people do a hell of a lot of work really quickly. Like, I feel like if you're on Kate's team, you say, we need an outfit for Kate, and that gets done.
Yeah, people don't sleep. They work around the clock to get it on time.
Definitely.
But I'm like, what else are they doing? Like, what?
Yeah.
Why don't they start planning farther in advance? It doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, first in line.
It's pretty obvious this week. It's Meghan. She won her case against Associated Newspapers, the publisher of the Mail on Sunday.
Woohoo! As we know, this case revolved around the publication of extracts of Meghan's private letter to her estranged father, Thomas Markle. And the judge, Justice Warby, accepted her application to make a summary judgment, sparing her a full trial in the autumn because he determined that the result is clear.
He said, it was, in short, a personal and private letter. The majority of what was published was about the claimant's own behaviour, her feelings of anguish about her father's behaviour as she saw it, and the resulting rift between them. These are inherently private and personal matters. The claimant had a reasonable expectation that the contents of the letter would remain private. The articles interfered with that reasonable expectation.
Boom. So she won the privacy case, and Justice Warby also found the publication of the letter infringed Meghan's copyright, which was another part of her case against Associated Newspapers. And he found that the Mail on Sunday's articles copied a large and important proportion of the work's original literary content. So the outstanding thing is the issue of whether Meghan was the sole author. This is what we talked about before, whether Jason Knauf, the former communications secretary for the Sussexes, was a co-author. And if he was, that could affect the level of damages. But the judge said that that should be determined at trial, although he said it was something of minor significance in the overall context.
Yeah, and this kind of little, I guess, footnote to the copyright case caused a bit of confusion in reporting the outcome.
And for us.
Yeah, and for us too, yeah. is it wasn't immediately clear whether this was a win or a lose for Meghan, but as the BBC's Johnny Diamond put it, the court dismissed Associated Newspaper's defence on privacy and copyright. The only ongoing dispute is about whose copyright has been breached, as there is some argument over whether it was just the Duchess that wrote the letter or whether she had some assistance.
The judgment that he put out is about 50 pages long, and there are some good lines that I thought we could pull out. Like, I really liked when he used the word fanciful.
Yeah.
He wrote, "For the reasons I've given, I conclude that the claimant would be bound to win at trial on this issue. It is fanciful to think otherwise."
Yeah, really good. He also said, the defendant's case is legally untenable or flimsy at best.
Yeah, and even went stronger when he said, "The defendant's factual and legal case on this copyright issue both seem to me to occupy the shadowland between improbability and unreality. The case is contingent, inferential, and imprecise."
This guy is like virtually poetic in his language about this. I loved his use of shadowland.
Yeah, and he talked about her calligraphy, her beautiful handwriting.
Yeah.
But Meghan released a statement herself after the judgment was given. We'll just read part of it. She said, "After 2 long years of pursuing litigation, I'm grateful to the courts for holding Associated Newspapers and the Mail on Sunday to account for their illegal and dehumanising practices. These tactics and those of their sister publications, Mail Online and the Daily Mail, are not new. For these outlets, it's a game. For me and so many others, it's real life, real relationships, and very real sadness. The damage they have done and continue to do runs deep."
The world needs reliable, fact-checked, high-quality news. What the Mail on Sunday and its partner publications do is the opposite. We all lose when misinformation sells more than truth, when moral exploitation sells more than decency, and when companies create their business model to profit from people's pain. But for today, with this comprehensive win on both privacy and copyright, we have all won.
I thought this was a really interesting statement, and obviously very strongly worded.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is a great victory for Meghan, and you know, it was kind of in my head because we had just watched the Framing Britney Spears documentary, the New York Times documentary on Britney, and while I was watching that, I was thinking about the Amy Winehouse documentary, and as well, like reading about Meghan, there was a lot of stuff about Caroline Flack and things like that, and it just seemed to strike me about how rare it is for a woman who has been targeted by these very dehumanizing tabloid practices to be able to stand up for herself. That oftentimes when we see these kind of cases, it's very high profile men.
Yeah.
People like Hugh Grant or other male celebrities basically, but that it's so often women who are treated in a much more abhorrent way, and that, you know, obviously with Britney and Amy Winehouse, it was a slightly different situation and it was more intense. But to be able to see a woman who can win like this, I think is very moving.
Yeah.
And we were obviously thrilled for Meghan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought that her statement was very powerful, and it definitely had like a kind of level of polish and almost theatricality that really reminded me of everything that I love about Meghan, and it has like this great like kind of reassuring confidence to it that we're all going to be okay, which I really liked.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of an impact, you know, I'm sure everyone listening will agree with us in that I don't think this is going to change how the tabloids cover Meghan in a major way. You know, leaks and stuff are slightly different, but I don't think the tone is going to dramatically change. And I don't know if the tone around how they cover women in general could possibly be changed by this, or what could change that. But I think her securing this win is still definitely something worth celebrating.
Absolutely. And of course the fact that she doesn't have to, you know, face her dad potentially in court, that must be a massive weight off her mind. Yeah,
and I would imagine the rest of the royal family would be celebrating this to some extent.
You'd hope.
For a selfish purpose, I mean.
Right, yeah.
And that they won't have to see their staff go to trial.
Yeah.
Even though we were all wondering what the Palace 4 were going to say, I think they'll be very relieved that they have been spared that.
Associated Newspapers released a statement. A spokesperson said, "We are very surprised by today's summary judgment and disappointed at being denied the chance to have all the evidence heard and tested in open court at a full trial. We are carefully considering the judgment's contents and will decide in due course whether to lodge an appeal." This appeal is likely to be on grounds to do with the wider implications of the judgment on the freedom of the press, but we don't know yet whether they're going to proceed with an appeal.
Yeah, we had talked before about how Byline Investigate said they almost certainly will, and I definitely wouldn't be surprised. I did notice that the Daily Mail reported this story on Meghan's win on page 13 of the print edition, and I think we all know how they would have reported it if it was the other way around. It's not entirely surprising, but I thought that was kind of funny. So what's next is that there will be a trial on the 2nd of March, which will be centred around damages, deciding how much damages and any outstanding issues related to the copyright claim. The Telegraph speculated a little bit on how much those damages could be, and they spoke to a lawyer who wanted to remain nameless, but who said that damages for the breach of privacy could be as high as £300,000, but that the award for the infringement of copyright could far exceed that, could be in the region of even £5 million.
And that's because the Duchess is entitled to seek an account of profits, so like any profit made by Associated Newspapers as a result of those articles using the letter. So that is why that figure is so high. And
as you said before, Meghan intends to donate any damages to an anti-bullying charity.
So let's hope that number is up at the £5 million then.
Yeah, I was surprised, honestly, because I didn't know how it was going to go, because we had talked about it and we thought, is this like a really obvious open and shut case? Listening in on the hearings, we didn't really get any indication, obviously, and this was such a great surprise this week, and I'm so thrilled for Meghan.
Yeah, it's great. I remember us like listening to the bit about the kind of sole or joint authorship part of it, and us being like, oh god, what does this mean for Meghan? And I'm like really delighted the bit that the judge said about kind of whether or not she's a sole author, it's still a breach of copyright. So like it still comes down to that. So I was like very reassured by that, and like you said, just delighted for Meghan.
And the fact that it's now been almost 2 years since those articles first appeared, and finally she can move on.
Yeah, and I really hope she makes so much money off them. Because like I do feel like the only way to stop those kind of things happening is for it just to be like not financially beneficial to run like someone's private letter, you know.
But anyway, we'll be waiting to find out what happens at this trial and to see if Associated Newspapers decide to appeal. Other than that, not a whole lot going on over the next week. We are still preparing our special episode on Camilla Parker Bowles. Camilla, who just got the vaccine this week with Prince Charles, which is great news.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be keeping an eye on her book club.
Yeah, this book club that is fucking racing through books.
Yeah.
Although got a little scoop this week. First interview with Daisy Edgar-Jones, who will be starring in the Where the Crawdads Sing adaptation, talking for the first time about it. Didn't know Camilla had that kind of showbiz power.
I know, incredible.
Mingling with celebrities. We will obviously be paying attention to Eugenie baby news.
Yeah.
How present or absent Andrew and Fergie are in any news sharing about this baby.
Little baby Casamigo. So until next time, take care, stay safe.
And thank you so much for listening. Have a great week. Bye.
Bye.
Grab a glass, amigo.
Our tequila is your tequila.